A god walks into a bar. Well, he did get into her, but I don't think it was by walking. I'm so sorry. Penultimate episode of HBO's Watchmen, and we get the backstory, the how and the why of actually a fair amount. Largely of Dr. Manhattan, but also more than a bit on Adrian Veidt. So this has a lot to cover. And it's very impressive how it manages to give us so much backstory without ever feeling like an info dump episode. This doesn't feel expositional. And the way it manages to not feel like that is by focusing in on the relationship between John and Angela. By zeroing in on that and having that be the core of everything, and that's what it keeps coming back to, and that's what's driving everything we see, and then framing all of the new information around that, it manages to be a satisfying little story about how these two met, how they came to love each other, what their life was like, while also giving us a ton of expositional information. This is really masterfully done in a lot of ways. The performance for Dr. Manhattan, this is great. It's really interesting because it is certainly a bit less detached than, say, Billy Crudup was in the Watchmen movie, but it does still have that air of inhumanness about it. But it's just a little bit warmer, which you kind of need if you're going to sell the idea that he is falling in love. Because in the Watchmen book, the comic, the emphasis for Dr. Manhattan was about how he was drifting further and further and further away from humanity, whereas this story is about how he reconnects. So if you're going to have that reconnection, you need to have at least a hint of that warmth in there, which this has. And there's one thing, here's a sentence I never thought I'd say. There's one specific element from the Watchmen comics that I actually think the TV show does better. And that is conveying the idea that Dr. Manhattan exists in all points of time along his own life simultaneously. That is an idea that's in the comic, but it's largely in what is, the backstory issue for Dr. Manhattan. So it's largely internal monologue. It's ideas that he's having in his own head being relayed to the reader. And it does convey that idea, but by having him have to explain and have interactions with people like Angela and have her understand it well enough to ask the question, where are you now? And they've been in a relationship for months, and he's saying, I'm seeing you at the bar. I'm about to do the egg. And, realizing the fullness of this, and the moment where it really all clicked into place is one of the last moments they share together. He says to her, this is the moment. This is the moment when I fell in love with you. And it's beautiful because it doesn't mean that he wasn't in love with her until the very end of their time together. It means that that was the point at which he fell in love. And that love, it exists across his entire time with her. That's just really well conveyed. And I actually think sells the idea better than the comic does. I'm not saying that to knock the comic. That concept of him existing at all points in time was, I don't want to say it was more of a background feature. It mattered, but it really was just an element of his character. That aspect wasn't a particularly much of a driver of the narrative, even in the issue where it featured most heavily. It was a really fascinating feature, and it was pretty well done, but here, by making that concept more central, and again, tying it to this relationship, I got into that idea a lot more here than I did in the comic. And like I said, I don't think I ever thought that I'd say some adaptational version or continuation of Watchmen would do any element from the comic better than the comic did. But this one, I kind of think it does. And I'm bowled over by that. And then we also find out some really interesting things about Adrian, about the place where he ended up. So finding out that John basically went to, I think it was Europa, and created the Garden of Eden for all intents and purposes, well, first of all, it makes sense because in the comics, he was on Mars and, just creating these spherical shapes, these grand things. But what's the next logical evolution of that? To start creating life. And so for him to go to a moon, it's not a planet, but a moon that he could work from and build all this at, that is a fairly logical step and extension. And it makes sense that it was something he would try to do. And realizing that where we've seen Adrian this whole time, it is his prison, but it wasn't designed to be. Or at least you could probably make the argument that Dr. Manhattan knew enough about how things were going to unfold in a more linear version of time that's what it would effectively be for Adrian. But there's really no direct textual evidence to indicate that he built that to be that man's prison. He seemed to very genuinely want to give Adrian what Adrian said he wanted: a clean slate, a chance to create an image of humanity that wouldn't keep screwing up. Because we basically find out that Adrian never left that station where he launched the squid attack from. He has stayed there, and he has just been watching the world keep almost tumbling back to the point that he worked so hard to try and pull humanity out of. And unsurprisingly, he does, the squid rains. Although one has to wonder who's still doing them. Did Adrian set it up to happen automatically after he left? Because it looks in this like he is having to do it manually. So it does make me wonder if that's a loop that's going to get closed. I'm not going to consider it a plot hole if it doesn't, but I did find myself wondering that. But it makes so much sense that after decades of him watching humanity fail to become the utopia that he had been so sure that he set them up to become, that he would want a clean slate and that he would accept the offer that John makes to him. Because I suspect in a less rundown version of Adrian wouldn't have accepted that. Might have seen where this would be a problem and where this would kind of start to crack him over time. But here he's just been worn down watching humanity stumble over and over and over and over again despite his best efforts. So I buy that. And I love his interactions with John. This sense of, yes, I did try and kill you that one time. Sorry about that. His arrogance, but also his loneliness. Adrian is a deeply, deeply lonely man. Largely his own fault because he put himself on this pedestal. This idea of that he is the smartest man on earth and no one else is close to him. He isolated himself. And also quite literally has isolated himself for the past few decades. And you can see the wear on his soul from having done that. And to see that reflected in his conversations and in his interactions with John is really, really well done. The whole episode, I'm gonna end up going back and forth, I think, as to whether my favorite episode is this one or the one where Angela was tripping on the nostalgia and we got the full backstory for her grandfather. Both of these episodes do a masterful job of using the tools that they have to convey this narrative and convey these ideas in a somewhat I was going to say detached, that's not right, in somewhat unraveled and not standard linear fashion, and have it pay massive dividends. I am just getting more and more and more and more impressed with this show. I am very nervous going into the final episode because I do not want them to drop the ball on this. I don't really have set expectations for what I think the finale should be. But even taking that into account, I just don't screw it up. At this point, the rest of the show has been so good, I don't even need the ending to be amazing. I just need it to not screw things up. Because I've had too many shows over my time as a television viewer where something really good fell apart at the end. Game of Thrones, Dexter, almost Gotham. That thing was crazy enough that even that really weak last season and last episode didn't really kill it for me. But like I'm endings are hard. Endings are really hard, and I'm going to be nervous going into this one. But for leading up to it, this is a surprisingly touching, really believable love story between effectively a god and a woman. And it does really sell the idea that he does fall in love with her, because with the comics, and again, this is not a knock on the comics, it's just the difference in approach. The comics, you got the sense that John was connecting with girlfriends and having these relationships, trying to hold on to his dwindling humanity. This was him trying to stay connected even as he became further and further distanced from people. But here, the angle is not he's trying to hold on, and it's slipping away, but rather he's found it again, and he's lovingly pulling himself closer and connecting with a human being, as opposed to feeling like it's slipping out of his grasp. And it manages to do that while feeling like the same character, like feeling like the same world. It's really good. Watchmen, episode 8. What did you think about it? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. I have a Patreon. That is, in fact, how I pay my bills and have this whole operation up and running. There are perks at every support level, but even if you're not able to do that, like, share, subscribe, and of course I want to see your comments and hear your thoughts on all this. All that helps me out, but you also don't have to. Take a relaxed attitude around here, so just come on back next time you need a break.